Is it time that the federal government took a look at the GST distribution once again? The Western Australian economy is going okay, and it's going okay compared to the other states and territories around the nation. In fact, Australian taxpayers will have to spend an extra $10 billion in debt to cover our GST deal. Do you say too bad, so sad, bad luck? Or, in terms of the national interest, should it be reviewed once again? On the line, independent economist Saul Eslake. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Ollie. Thank you for having me on your show.
That's my pleasure, Saul. You know that GST are fighting words in Western Australia.
Indeed I do. I've been there many times, and I'm well aware of the passion with which Western Australians argue they have been, as they put it, unfairly treated by previous GST revenue sharing arrangements. I always make the point that you never heard complaints from Western Australians or Western Australian state governments about exactly the same arrangements for the 70 years prior to about 2003-04, when Western Australia got a bigger share of whatever loot was going around than it would have got if it was distributed on an equal per capita basis. But since the onset of the mining boom almost 20 years ago, Western Australia's share of revenue from the GST has fallen considerably below what it would have gotten had it been shared out on an equal per capita basis, which it has been. And many Western Australians, I am very well aware, feel that that is in some way unfair.
All right,
and
but now it's the other states. Sorry, Saul. I was just going to say, but now it's the other states and territories who might be unfairly treated.
Well, the other states and territories certainly feel that they will be unfairly treated from 2026-27 onwards, when they will have to wear the cost of the deal which Scott Morrison imposed on all of the states and territories 3 years ago, and which is now starting to be phased in the current financial year, whereby it doesn't really matter how the Grants Commission assesses the capacity of each state and territory to raise revenue and the cost to each state and territory of providing state-type public services like schools and hospitals and police and public housing and the like. Western Australia will never get less than 70, or from 2024-25, 75% of what it would have gotten under a notional equal per capita distribution. This is, I've said, a little like for Western Australia, a little like what Chinese President Xi Jinping would call a win-win outcome. That is to say, it doesn't matter whether the iron ore price goes up or down, Western Australia wins. And for the moment, until 26-27, the federal government has to pony up what's required in order to make sure that the eastern states aren't worse off as a result of this very favourable deal for Western Australia. But as things currently stand, from 2026-27 onwards, when the federal government's no worse off guarantee to the eastern states expires, the eastern states will have to cop that.
Both the Treasurers of New South Wales and Victoria, obviously a Liberal Treasurer and a Labor Treasurer, they're on a unity ticket with this issue, particularly taking aim at WA, and it'll become a federal election issue, do you reckon, again, Saul?
Well, probably not, because the opposition leader, Anthony Albanese, has been saying, as he has been on so many other issues, that there is no difference between Labor's policy on this and the coalition's, that they will keep in place the deal which the coalition imposed on all of the states and territories 3 years ago, and they won't change it. And I suppose the motivation for the Labor Party is exactly the same as it is for the coalition, that in order to win the next election, the Labor Party needs to pick up seats in Western Australia, which, based on the results of the last state election, if they were transferred, if they were repeated at the federal level, they'd have a good chance of picking up 3 or 4 of them. Similarly, the coalition can't afford to lose any.
No, they can't. If we took the politics out of this and looked at this just from a purely economic point of view, Saul, should it be changed now? The WA economy, it's going okay compared to the rest of the country, and obviously the Australian economy is going okay compared to the rest of the world thanks to COVID-19, but WA probably doesn't quite need the top-up that it had once upon a time, Saul, and the complaints we've had over the last decade or so.
Well, that's exactly the point. I mean, it's perhaps worth saying, as I think I've said over in Western Australia many times before, that the Grants Commission was established in 1933 after Western Australians voted 2-1 to secede from the Federation on the actually reasonably justified grounds that they had been dudded by the financial arrangements that were put in place at the time of Federation in 1901. But the Privy Council in London, which in those days had the final say on these things, pointed to the first clause in the preamble to the Constitution, which said indissoluble Commonwealth, and that means what it says. So you can't actually secede, but the Commonwealth Government at the time established the Grants Commission to provide a independent and systematic assessment of the claims that Western Australia, along with South Australia, Queensland and Tasmania, had for better financial treatment at the hands of the federal government. And from 1936 onwards, when the Grants Commission established the principle that federal money should be doled out to the states in such a way as to enable each state to provide similar standards of public services to its citizens whilst levying similar levels of state taxes, that principle had been in place ever since then, and Western Australia had been a beneficiary of it continually from 1936 until about 2003-04, when, thanks to the mining boom, Western Australia went from being a relatively poor state, not so much that it was less capable of raising revenue than the eastern states, but the cost of providing public services to a relatively small population dispersed over such a huge area, 1/3 of Australia's continent, that deserved additional assistance from the Commonwealth. But since the onset of the mining boom and the enormous mineral royalty revenues that Western Australia has been able to generate, not so much through its own efforts, but because the Chinese have been willing to pay inordinately high prices for unprecedented volumes of Western Australia's iron ore in particular, and more recently its natural gas, that Western Australia is now the only government in Australia, and as far as I can tell, one of only about 5 in the world that is running budget surpluses, both in the current financial year and for the next 4 or 5 years. And in that sense, the idea that the federal government should be, over the next 6 or 7 years, borrowing an extra $10 billion in order to make those surpluses even bigger than they would be otherwise, and that after 26, 27, the eastern states and territories who aren't as rich as Western Australia, and most of whom are running deficits, should be forced to run bigger deficits or cut their services to their citizens or raise their taxes on their citizens in order to give more money to Western Australia is, if you live on this side of the 139th parallel, a bit galling.
A bit galling. I think you're just a bit jealous, or that you're in Tasmania and we're in WA, mate.
Well, yes, and you also get 2 football teams in the AFL and we can't even have one. So not that we blame Western Australians for that. That's the AFL who's headquartered in Melbourne. But, Western Australia is, as you said, doing very well. The economy is strong and lots of people are employed, and your per capita incomes are about 50% higher than the rest of the country. And again, I make point that no other state has ever been as wealthy relative to the rest of the country as Western Australia has been in the last 10 years relative to the eastern states. And that's why Western Australia's share of GST revenues relative to what it would notionally get if they were carved up on an equal per capita basis has been unprecedentedly low. I mean, yes, that's never happened before, but it's never happened before because there's never been a time in Australia's history where one state has been so much richer than the rest of Australia as Western Australia has been as a result of the mining boom. And I think it's outrageous that principles that have been in place since the mid-1930s, which were originally instituted in justified recognition of Western Australia's grievances about the original Federation Compact, have now been in effect torn up in order to benefit what is now the richest state in the country and the only government which is running budget surplus.
Saul, we'll leave it there. At least we can both agree we're both against the Victorians.
Yeah, that's absolutely fair enough. And I'm sure you will get lots of comments saying that guy from the eastern states from Tasmania doesn't know what he's talking about and he ought to pull his head in and all that sort of thing. But I'm used to that.
We appreciate your time, Saul. Have a good night.
Thank you for having me on your show, Lee. I appreciate it.